history session, a Bharatiya history itihas session. And I would like to welcome very stalwart and distinguished scholar, Dr. Koenraad to giving us the time. I know he is very, very busy, but seeing him here, it delights me that he can come to this program. So today, topic of our discussion is the state of the art in Aryan homeland debate, time of the day.
Yes.
Okay, so we are here today because this topic in some way is very, very important to us. And Aryavat was not the homeland of Aryans, was one of the most important dearest subjects to the British colonial Raj. And it paid historians, scholars, and the marxists. They cooked up the theory of Aryan invasion on Bharat around 1500 BC. As we know, according to this theory, that there was a superior race who came from outside, probably from Central Asia, and formed the Vedic civilization. Unfortunately, many English-educated Bharati scholars, historians, scientists, leaders also have fallen in this manipulation. Although many of them were great patriots and were ready to sacrifice their lives for the independence of Bharat. Fortunately, for the common people of India, it was ridiculous even to think about it, not because they were uneducated or unwise, but because of their firm conviction and pride that their source of existence is Sanatan and their culture is oldest and most advanced Vedic civilization on the planet Earth. They will do everything to save and preserve this great culture and civilization, which was based on immortal dharma. It was very important and precious to them. Perhaps that is why Bharat Sanskrit has survived after so many attacks and atrocities by the foreigners. Ancient Bharat was at its zenith in all areas of science, mathematics, performing arts, music, languages, and above all, the most important, Adhyatma Vidya. As Krishna says, the greatest, I am the greatest of Adhyatma Vidya among the all Vidyas. He is the length of Arya, activities prevailed when these did not exist and other cultures also as well. And no history was recorded. In Rigveda and Sanskrit literature, Arya is a person whose goal is spiritual advancement. He truly knows the values of life and has a civilization based on a spiritual realization. It has nothing to do with racial groupings like Aryan and the Millions. I will quote Sri Aurobindo from his book, India's Rebirth. It distresses us to see Indian inquiries with their great opportunities simply following in the path of certain European scholars, accepting and adding of their unstable fantasies, their huge superstructures founded on weak and scattered evidence, and their imaginative history of our prehistorical ages. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce you. Actually, he does not need an introduction, but well, let me, some of you may have joined first time, so I will uh, do a little bit of that. Dr. Koenraad obtained his doctorate in Oriental Philosophy and History from Catholic University of Leuven, Belgium, in 1998. This was based on his MA degree in Sinology. Indo-Iranian Studies and Philosophy, and a research stay at Banaras Hindu University. Dr. Koenraad is presently affiliated to the Sangam University of Buddhist and Indic Studies and occasionally teaches at the Indus University, Ahmedabad. He is a chairman of Ram Sarup and Sitaram World Memorial Fund of Delhi, dependent on the Indic Academy, Hyderabad. He has also studied aspects of Daoism and take part in many short retreats of Zen, Vipassana, Himalayas, Yoga, Ashvigyan Gurukulam, Coimbatore, and Siraspur, Pennsylvania. Yoga Niketan, Rishikesh, Brahmdeshi Ashram, Chandigarh, the European Union of Yoga, and a board member of Dutch language Belgium Yoga Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Koenraad. Please, sir.
Yes, namaste, everyone. So we're going to talk about a very topical subject in India. The rest of the world, considers it an academic subject, but in India, it's a very hot topic because there are very many people who use the so-called Aryan Invasion Theory to score political points against the Hindus. So the Hindus oppose that. And we're going to see how this debate is faring nowadays. So we're going to use a PowerPoint. There we go. Yes. Okay. Right. So let's proceed right away. So we are talking about the Indo-European language family, which unites all the languages here represented in colors. The blue ones, the right hand, the southeastern end, is Indo-Iranian, spoken in North India and Iran. Then the green one is Slavic with Russian. The light green is Baltic, Lithuanian and Latvian. You may not have heard of them. The red one is Germanic with German and English. The beige one is Romance with French, Spanish, Italian. Then you may see a yellow one in Greece, that's Greek, of course, and a purple one in Armenia, that's Armenian. Then there are several languages extinct that have existed, that we know existed, like Hittite, Tocharian, Thraco-Phrygian, and Proto-Bangani. That latter language, Proto-Bangani, is a layer of a number of words still persisting in a dialect spoken in Uttarakhand. Some vaguely Hindi dialect, but with a layer of words that are not Hindi, that are leftovers from an earlier language spoken there. And that language, strangely, is very much like Proto-Indo-European, that is to say, it is older than Sanskrit. Older than Vedic. And it has the characteristics that have been preserved far away in European languages, in Celtic, in Germanic, and so on. And the fact that it exists in India shows that those languages originate in India, or at any rate support that thesis. So we're going to ask where all these languages come from. And I've already shown my hand. I think they come from India, but that at the moment is a minority opinion. So that's why there's a debate going on. So there is one ancestress, one original language from which all the present languages, German, French, Russian, Hindi, Marathi, and so on, originate. That was spoken about 3,700 years before the Common Era, 5,700 years ago. which is reconstructed by comparative historical linguistics. Now that term sounds ominous to many Hindus. They don't like the term because it cuts through borders. It doesn't coincide with India or with South Asia or the Indian subcontinent. On the contrary, it includes many non-Indian languages spoken in Central Asia and Europe, and it excludes, it does not contain some Indian languages, namely Dravidian and Munda. So I hear many Hindu nationalists shouting, oh, this is a colonialist concoction, this is racist, this is meant to break India. Well, that I think is not true at all. That has in fact nothing to do with it. It's just you use the method of comparative historical linguistics and then you let the chips fall where they may. And you know what you get in the case of Indo-European is a family uniting most European and most Indian languages, but not some other Indian languages. Aha. So there is another language family, Uralic, which contains Finnish, Hungarian, Estonian, you know, a number of languages in Northeastern Europe and Northwestern Asia, in Russia. And so all those people are white. The people who studied those languages were also white. Those areas were not colonized. So there was no colonial and no racial angle at all. And that language family was mapped already in 1730 before Indo-European. So you can perfectly apply this method of comparative historical linguistics and no colonialism, no racism need be involved. For those who doubt my words, you know, it will not be any use to show you any Western explanation of what I've just said, but there is a very, very fine Indian explanation written specifically with these sensitivities of the Indian audience in mind, and that is by Shrikant Talageri. I have sent this PowerPoint to the organizers. They can send it afterwards to all of you. So you don't need to take notes or something. The references given here will be sent to you. And so please check for yourself the papers referred to that you can simply find on the website or the blog spot of Shrikant Talageri. So I've given the electronic references here and you can check for yourself. So what I'm saying is that Sanskrit is close to Latin, is linked to Latin, is a sister of Latin, and it is not of Tamil. This means that it is cognate to Latin, it belongs to the same family. It is not of Tamil, but it is contiguous to Tamil. They live together, they have lived together for thousands of years. And so it has enormously influenced Tamil, but that's a different thing. Some or many Hindus have something against the notion of linguistics because they associate it with the Aryan Invasion Theory. People who defend the Aryan Invasion Theory are always saying, oh, but linguistics has proven it. I will show that that's not true, but that's a very common belief. And so Indians, you know, in reaction, start associating linguistics with the very harmful Aryan Invasion Theory. And so they resent linguistics. Now that's a total mistake, especially because linguistics originates in India. You see, the very first Sanskrit word I ever learned was in school, the word sandhi, right? You know that word, I think. Like, for instance, the word Dalitodaya was used by the Arya Samaj a century ago. this meant Dalita Udaya, so the upliftment of the broken men, meaning the lowest castes, right? So this A in Dalita and the U in Udaya was pulled together in O, Dalitodaya. And so this euphonic combination of succeeding sounds, one of the last word, one of the next word, that is called Sandhi. Now, in my own language, in Dutch, you find the same thing. For instance, take the word dat ding, which is the English that thing, yes? Now, in standard Dutch, as it is spoken in Holland, you have a forward sandhi. The first word dat adapts to the next word ding. So you get dat ding. It's voiced, dat ding. Whereas the first word dat normally ends in an unvoiced sound, dat. Now in the Flemish dialects of Dutch, you get the reverse. You get datting. The second word adapts to the first. It's a retro sandhi. Okay, it's instead of a forward sandhi like in Holland, you have a backward sandhi. And so that whole phonetic phenomenon was explained to us by our teacher with the Sanskrit word sandhi. You see, he said, okay, you see, this is the way that sounds influence one another, harmonize with each other. And that was invented, that was discovered in India thousands of years ago. And they called it sandhi. And so till today, Western linguists use this Sanskrit word. So Hindus ought to be proud of their linguists. You see, unfortunately, nowadays, because of the Aryan Invasion Theory, they mistakenly reject linguistics, thinking that it automatically implies the Aryan Invasion Theory. It doesn't. By the way, if you want to feel proud of Sanskrit linguistics, then think of this. The table of elements, the table of Mendeleev, remember, you learned it all in school. That was based on the Sanskrit alphabet. You see, there is a regularity and order in the Sanskrit alphabet. So when Mendeleev studied this, you see, he thought, oh my God, you see, this is the order, this is the harmony that I have to apply to the system of elements. And so that way he developed and discovered the periodic table of elements, right? So Sanskrit is great. And so, of course, it produced the first and greatest grammarians. And modern linguistics, including the construction of the Proto-Indo-European language, would not have been possible without the Sanskrit grammarians. So what you have in India is what is called a Sprachbund, you know, a languages union or a linguistic area. You have different language families, totally different. You have Iranian in the northwest with Pashto and Baluchi and Dari. Then you have Indo-Aryan in most of India. That's light green here. Then you have Dravidian in the south, which is blue here, with a little outlier Brahui in the northwest. Then you have in purple the Munda languages, and in red the Tibeto-Burmese languages. And then above in Kashmir, you have another little light blue language that's called Burushaski. That's a language unrelated to all the others. Anyway, all these languages have been greatly influenced by Sanskrit, even if they are not related to Sanskrit. So that, you see, of all the Indian languages, personally, I've only mastered somewhat Sanskrit and Hindi, but you see speakers of Kannada or Telugu or so, and at the same time or who know Hindi, tell me that you can easily, once you know one Indian language, all the others become easy because you can translate every sentence construction literally from one language to the other, because the sentence patterns are the same. After thousands of years of bilingualism, where many Tamils spoke Sanskrit, where many Marathi speakers spoke Kannada, and vice versa, and so on, they have all come to converge. They're all the same. So you get a linguistic area or Sprachbund, where all these languages have gradually developed similar characteristics. Like, for example, the retroflex sounds, ta, ra, ra, na, la. They, some linguists have thought in the beginning that they were introduced from Dravidian into Indo-Aryan. That's not the case at all. In the Dravidian languages, they are a foreign introduction, a Fremdkörper, a foreign body. And this you can see by the fact that Dravidian words don't have these sounds at the beginning, whereas Sanskrit does. Like, for instance, shad, shad, shad meaning six, shadyantra, a six-pointed star or a conspiracy, shah. So in Sanskrit, these words can perfectly be at the beginning, tund, and so on. Whereas in Tamil, they are elsewhere, but not at the beginning, because it's too difficult for them, because it's a foreign sound. Then you have many tatsama and tadbhava words, meaning a tadbhava word is a word that has evolved. Like, for instance, in Tamil, you have the word Chettiar, is the name of a caste, a particular trader's caste. Chettiar, that's a bastardization or an evolved form from Shreshti, which is a pure Sanskrit word. Now, that word Shreshti also exists in most Indian languages, but then it is a literal borrowing from Sanskrit or a tatsama word, whereas Chettiar is a tadbhava word, is an evolved form of the same word. Then you have also many Dravidian loan words in Sanskrit, like mina, meaning fish. Whereas, Sanskrit had no need of borrowing this word because they had the word matsya, also meaning fish. Nevertheless, they like to become a national language, and so they adopted some Dravidian words. Anyway, so India is a linguistic area. It has developed a certain linguistic unity, but the linguistic fact is also that, after all, a number of different languages have come from totally different origins. Then you see the fact that I speak of as ancestral language, which is ancestral to both Sanskrit and Greek and Russian and Germanic and so on. Many people will resent that. And they argue, oh, but you see, there is no proof of such a language. You see, well, that's true. You see, there is no proof that your great-grandfather existed. Maybe he lived before the age of photography, and anyway, photos can be photoshopped, so they don't prove anything. So there is just no proof. Maybe in the town hall, they have a record of his birth and death. But again, you see, these documents can be falsified, can be doctored. So who knows? There is no real proof that your great-grandfather existed. And yet, I know 100% sure that he existed. Why? Well, because you exist. And if you didn't have that great-grandfather, then you wouldn't be there. Very simple. So you see, ancestral forms of Sanskrit have certainly existed, and the proof is that Sanskrit exists. Right. Okay. Now, what I'm saying here is nothing revolutionary. It's very normal. You can see it in later languages. For example, we have texts of Latin 2000 years ago, and then we see this language disintegrate and its dialects, its like vulgar form, start differentiating. And so one evolves in the direction of Spanish, one evolves in the direction of Romanian or Italian or French. And so we have a complete documentation of how these languages grew apart from a common origin. Now that happened the last 2000 years. Here I'm talking about something that happened the last 6,000 years, but it certainly happened. Then it also happens that we have languages relatively close to the original form. We have languages from about 1500 BC, namely Hittite and Mycenaean Greek, and most Western linguists also add Vedic Sanskrit on the assumption, first made by Friedrich Max Müller, that Vedic Sanskrit is about 1500 to 1200 BC. Right? We will talk more about that chronology. But so he assumed that, and so many people think that it is contemporaneous with Hittite and Mycenaean Greek. At any rate, at 3,500 years in the past, it is a lot closer to Proto-Indo-European than any modern language can be. Okay, now when was this whole thing discovered? The first impression that Indian languages were related to their own language, to Italian, to English, to Dutch even, was already mentioned by some travelers. The first one was an English Jesuit called Thomas Stephens in 1583, right? But so that was all very fragmentary. Now, the first person who really studied it in depth and built the whole system of Indo-European was a French Jesuit, Gaston Laurent Coeur-Doux. And mind you, he lived in India, very important. Then this was in 1767. Then this was made known to the world, or to the English-speaking world, in a speech by William Jones, whom you see depicted here, who was a judge in Calcutta. And he speaks very highly, very praisingly of Sanskrit, that he thinks is more perfect than Latin or Greek. You see, some people in India say that it was all Europeans looking down on India and so on. On the contrary, you see, the idea of Proto-Indo-European was thought up by people who stood completely in awe of India. At the same time, there was the French first Orientalist, namely Abraham Hyacinthe Anquetil du Perron, who published translations of the Persian Avesta and of the Sanskrit Upanishads. And so in Europe, they woke up. You know, they started to see that India had something great to offer. And so there was a movement of Indomania, of great enthusiasm for India. And the classic of that movement is a book called Language and Wisdom of the Indians by Friedrich Schlegel, published in 1808. This is also where for the first time the word Aryan is used, in the sense of Indo-European. And this word, mind you, is taken from both Vedic and Avestan, not yet Hittite, that wasn't discovered yet, but it also appears in Hittite the word Aryan or Arya, and it has the meaning there of a self-reference, of meaning us, our tribe, and all the fellow tribesmen. You see, there's been a lot of study about what the original meaning would be. Some people say it means to plow, to practice agriculture. Mm-hmm. And indeed, you have a Latin word arare, which means to plow. Then some others, particularly Marxists in India, say that it meant to possess, ownership. So they have this idea of unequal economic relations, the haves and the have-nots, and oppression and so on. So they find that perfectly expressed in their explanation of Arya. There is another theory that says that it's a borrowed word, that it comes from Semitic. Maybe you remember 10 years ago, there was the Arab Spring, and you may have heard of the Egyptian Cairo square called Tahrir Square. Now, Tahrir means liberation, and it comes from a root harar, which means free. And so some people opine that that is the origin of Arya, that it means free, and originally pronounced ar, ar, with a throat sound. Now, all these theories are very interesting, at least for me they are, but they're not important here. You see, by the time of the Vedas, the word had another specific meaning. It meant a fellow tribesman. It meant us. The Iranians called themselves Arya. In fact, that's where the word Iran comes from. Iran comes from Airyanam Kshatra. You know, the state, the domain of the Aryans. And they did not call the Indians Arya. Whereas the Indians, the Vedic Indians, who in fact can be identified with the Puru tribe, one of the 5 tribes, the Puru tribe, they all call themselves Arya. And mind you, sometimes some members of their tribe defect and side with the enemies. Well, they are still called Arya, even though they're hated, they're loathed, still they are Arya because they are members of the tribe. By contrast, outsiders who support the tribe, who fight along, who are allies, they are still not called Arya. They are praised, they're termed brave and whatever, but they're not called Arya because they're not members of the tribe. So the word Arya originally means a fellow tribesman. Later, when the Vedic tradition spreads outside this tribe and all across India, then the word Arya comes to mean Puru and effectively Vedic, comes to refer to the Vedic tradition. This you find in the name, in the modern name Arya Samaj. Arya Samaj means the association of the Vedicists, of those who are loyal to the Vedas. Then the meaning noble, like you find in Buddhism, the 4 noble truths, the noble eightfold path, that comes even later, right? So in the Vedas, that's not the meaning. Okay, so at that time, between about 1770 and 1840, everybody believes in the out of India theory. That is the only game in town. Nobody questions it, right? Everybody assumed all these languages, all these European languages originate in India. That remains the official theory till about 1840. And so a number of Western thinkers like Voltaire, Kant, Herder, and Michelet explicitly say so, all right? You see a certain Indomania, people praising India, praising Indian ideas, wanting Europe to learn from India. So that's the atmosphere at the time. And then it will disappear in a way that we're going to explain. And the out of India theory is then revived around 1990. It starts with a book by K.D. Setna, the retired secretary of Sri Aurobindo. He was already in his 90s when he wrote this. And so that book is called Karpasa, meaning cotton, the Sanskrit word for cotton, because cotton is well attested in the Harappan cities archaeologically, but it's not present. It's not present in the Rig Veda. So he concluded from that the Rig Veda is older than the Harappan cities. So whether that's true or not, at any rate, that got the out of India theory going again. So from that point, it was revived and then started the debate between the out of India theory and the other theory that had become dominant by then. The term out of India theory was coined by Edwin Bryant in about 1997. So before that, everybody believed the out of India theory, but the word out of India theory did not exist yet. Right, so then the history of Indo-European studies begins with a character called Franz Bopp, who in 1816 published a comparative study of Sanskrit, trying to liken the grammar of Sanskrit with that of Latin and Greek. A little idea on the side of this Franz Bopp is that he links Indo-European with Malayo-Polynesian or Austronesian, the language is spoken in Indonesia, in Hawaii, in New Zealand, on Easter Island and so on, which of course is hard to explain if Indo-European came from the West. You see, it could be possible if it came from India or even from more to the southeast of India, because we don't know. Manu is said to have landed after the flood coming from the south. So we don't know how far south. You see, was it South India or was it even farther away, Indonesia or so? That's interesting. But at any rate, it militates against the idea that the language came from Europe. And so later, this theory has been reiterated by a certain Isidore Dayan, a prominent American linguist, and very recently in India by Shrikant Talageri. Okay, let's move on. So the Aryan Invasion Theory starts in 1834 with August Schlegel, who was the brother of Friedrich Schlegel, who idealized India so much. So August Schlegel posits a homeland outside India, in the Caucasus Mountains, or near there. And so initially, this is a controversial theory. Scholars defend the out of India theory. You see, this is often forgotten nowadays. Defenders of the Aryan invasion theory act as if, you see, Indo-European linguistics has always believed in the Aryan invasion theory. That's not true. The first 60, 70 years, everybody believed in the out of India theory. And then it was an innovation. It was a novelty to posit a homeland outside India. And so not everybody took it lying down. One of the great defenders of the out of India theory, and this will greatly surprise you, was a colonialist par excellence, Mount Stuart Elphinstone. He was an important functionary of the East India Company. He was, among other things, the governor of Mumbai Presidency. And after his political career, he retired and he wrote a history of India. And so in that history of India, he writes that in none of the writings in the Manusmriti or in the Vedas, there is any hint that Indians or Hindus came from outside India. There is no proof of this in writing. You know, there was no archaeology and so on yet, but you see the written testimony at any rate militated against any foreign origin. Now, it is true that, for instance, the Russians don't remember any foreign origin either, but that's normal because of the time lapse. You see, writing in that part of the world only started in maybe 1000 after Christ, whereas they settled in this country like 2,000-3,000 years before Christ. So there's 3,000-4,000 years in between. That's long enough to forget something. And even then, some branches of Indo-European have a certain memory. The Irish do remember that they came to Ireland as conquerors. The Scandinavians likewise. So in their case, even if centuries have passed, they still had a very vague, very elementary memory of it. Moreover, this time-lapse argument doesn't apply in the case of Vedic, because in the Aryan Invasion Theory, they only invade India in about 1500 BC, and right away they compose the Rig Veda. So that Rig Veda should have some memories of the invasion. And if it doesn't, no, that's very significant. It means that very probably there never was such an invasion. So he accepts that the commonality between Sanskrit, Latin, Greek, and so on shows that there is a common origin. However, it doesn't say anything about where that common origin was. There is no proof for the Caucasus or any homeland outside India. Moreover, once August Schlegel posited the Caucasus, many people thought, oh yeah, this is clever because this is just halfway in the expanse of the Indo-European family. You have Bengal and Sri Lanka on one side. You have Portugal, Ireland, Iceland on the other side. And about halfway between them is the Caucasus, or the steppes just north of it. So that looks very fine. However, as we can see in other languages that have greatly expanded, like for instance, Russian. You see, the expanse of Russia goes from Belarus and Ukraine in the west, all the way to Alaska in the east. Now, halfway would be some Siberian city like Irkutsk or Novosibirsk. And yet that is not the homeland of Russian at all. Russian started in what is now Ukraine, in the farthest west, and then spread all the way to Alaska, all going east. And they didn't go west. Sometimes Russian people went west, but over there it was already full of Poles, of Germans, and so on. Any Russian who came to live there adapted, lost his language, and became Polish or German. And so, you know, this Elphinstone is very rational, very logical, and so he's not impressed by this argument of symmetry, of being in the middle. And so he concludes, you see, the question is still open. There is no reason whatever for thinking that the Hindus ever inhabited any country but their present country. But you see, that didn't help. And also the focus, the center of the debate had moved then from India to Europe. Add to this the background fact that India was becoming less important. India used to be some mystery country in the distance, but during the 19th century, it declined and became a mere colony. So it was less impressive, and so it became also a colony in the history of Indo-European that came from elsewhere. And so within 10 years or so, everybody believed in the Aryan Invasion Theory. So if India was also Indo-European, it was because it had been invaded at some point. Now, there were different opinions about where this homeland was, if it was not India. But gradually, the consensus grew that it was indeed not far from where August Schlegel had put it, just north of the Caucasus, in a culture that is now identified by archaeologists as Yamnaya, which means pit grave. You see, the people were buried vertically, pit grave. So that culture is now widely identified with the homeland. This has to do with the theories of Gordon Childe, whom you see above, and Maria Gimbutas, whom you see below. She called it the Kurgan steppes. Kurgans were grave hills. You see, elite people had a hill built above their grave. And so some people say, yes, that's, for instance, the origin of the stupa, the Buddhist stupa, which contains relics of the Buddha, part of his dead body. So that goes back, according to this theory, to the grave hills built in the Yamna culture, the so-called Kurgans. So this is the theory that now we are up against. This is the Aryan Invasion Theory. So you have a homeland between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, north of the Caucasus Mountains. And so from there it all expanded. So it seems right because it lies just in the middle, but that's not convincing, I think. Moreover, it has this going for it, that it is true for the European half of the story. In Europe, you clearly have an Aryan invasion confirmed by archaeology, confirmed by genetics. You have a new type of people exterminating the earlier people. You have new kinds of pottery, new graves, new houses, and so on. There's a really totally new culture penetrating Europe in about 2900 to 2500 BC. And they came from this Yamna culture in Russia. Now, unfortunately for the Aryan Invasion Theory, several leading scholars who are often cited as supporting the Aryan Invasion Theory have said that this homeland in Russia is in fact a secondary homeland. The people there settled later. And so from the viewpoint of Europe, this was the homeland, this was where they came from. But before that, they had come from yet elsewhere. And now the question is where? So Paul Haggerty says, well, maybe from Anatolia, present-day Turkey. David Reich, the geneticist, says, well, from Iran. And I say, well, from India. But so not from this, this Yamna culture. Some scholars object to my or our using the term invasion, Aryan Invasion Theory. They say, no, it was not an invasion, it was a peaceful immigration. Well, that's strange. Most migrations in the old days were matters of conquest, unless there was nobody living there. The first people who went to New Zealand, they came in virgin territory. They didn't have to wage war. But otherwise, it's always a matter of fighting. And when they discovered some corpses lying around in Mohenjo-daro, immediately they said, these are the victims of the Aryan invasion. And Indra, the war god of the Aryans, he stands accused of destroying the Harappan civilization. Well. Now, at least this theory has the advantage that it acknowledges the reality of conquest, of violent migration, because that's the rule rather than the exception in human history. And so a famous champion of the Aryan Invasion Theory, a French scholar called Bernard Sergent, ridicules this whole idea of a conflict-free Aryanization of India. You see, he says very certainly there was a conquest, there was an invasion. Moreover, the word invasion does not designate the means, the military means by which an immigration was effected. No, it concerns the result. In an invasion, the immigrants take power. They do not adapt to the existing indigenous culture. No, they impose their own culture on the indigenous people. Now, that's certainly what happened if the Aryans came from outside India, because they imposed their language and their religion on the natives. That's what I call an invasion. Then there is the racial aspect. You see, in the beginning, this was not there. And, racial thought has not always existed, or certainly not as a serious intellectual doctrine. That starts only in the middle of the 19th century. So it so happens that Schlegel's choice of the Caucasus already had the racist element in it, though he didn't mean to, because the Caucasus area was also deemed to be the homeland of the white race. And so by 1855, Arthur de Gobineau, a French thinker, connected the dots, linked Caucasus as the white homeland with the Caucasus as the Indo-European homeland. And so he thought the Aryans or Indo-Europeans were in fact the white race. At the time, there was also a lot of conflict with the Jews, so it also came to connote non-Jews. At the same time, Charles Darwin launched his book about the favored races in the history of mankind, how they succeed through survival of the fittest. And so that's a justification for all violence. It means that the best are winning and deserve to win. And the British colonialist par excellence, the Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, called race the key to all of history. And so the next step logically was that the Aryans were deemed blonde and blue-eyed, and the homeland was located not even in the Caucasus, but in northern Germany or Denmark. Then the Rig Veda was read through a racial lens, and everything was interpreted as a matter of race. Like, for instance, Anas, which really means mouthless, that is to say, not understandable, speaking a garbled language, was interpreted as Nas, without nose, meaning flat-nosed. So that's apparently a characteristic of non-Europeans, of Africans. Then all words for black that do appear in the Veda are suddenly identified with natives, the black aboriginals, whereas the text doesn't say so. Moreover, you should know that black is often, in many languages, a metaphor for the enemy. Like in the Second World War, the collaborators of the Germans and Japanese were called blacks, in British security reports about Subhas Chandra Bose, who collaborated with the Axis, he is consistently referred to as a black. Then the word Varna, meaning color or symbolically quality, and which also meant the different classes of Hindu society, was interpreted as skin color. So caste system was interpreted as a sort of racial apartheid system. Then the most famous of all, and here I can claim a discovery for myself, is in the Battle of the 10 Kings, where the priest of the Aryans is described as white-clad, Shviknia, which some translators translate as white-skinned. And by contrast, the enemies are described as the Asikni Visha. Visha is a people, a tribe. Asikni means black. That was perfect, from the Aryan invasion perspective. This was a description of the black aboriginals. Well, no. Asikni is in fact the name of a river. And the text itself says twice that the enemy came from that river basin, namely from the Asikni River in present-day Pakistan, which really means the Black River. Is a normal name for a river. Like the Thames, for example, in England, the word Thames is related to the Sanskrit word tamas and means dark. So the Thames means the dark river, right? And other rivers are also named after their aspect, what they look like the Yellow River in China. And so here the Asikni means the Black River. So Asikni Visha means the people from the Black River, which is exactly where the enemy comes from. When they come to the Ravi Basin or Parushni Basin, where the Vedic people are staying. And moreover, the enemy comes from the west. The Chenab or the Asikni lies to the west of the Parushni River. So the Vedic people are coming from the east, whereas in the Aryan invasion theory, they should be coming from the west. See, so you see, this racist paradigm caused misunderstandings and mistranslations that have had enormous consequences. Now, this racial interpretation is totally contrary to Hindu tradition, where the word Arya has neither a linguistic nor a racial meaning. For instance, in the Manu Smriti, the Greeks and the Chinese are called fallen Aryas. That is to say, they are imagined to have been Vedic people, but they gave up doing the Vedic rituals, right? So they are fallen Aryas, but at any rate, with their race, with their foreign language, they are perfectly qualified to be Aryas. They are imagined to have been Aryas. So Arya is not a matter of language and not a matter of race. Against the increasing identification of Aryan or Indo-European language family with an Aryan race, the much maligned Max Muller has said, I have declared again and again that if I say Aryan, I mean neither blood nor bones, nor hair nor skull. I simply mean those who speak an Aryan language. You see, from the beginning, from the 18th century, they already knew that a language can cross racial frontiers. You see, either Indo-European originated in India with the brown people and spread and was taken over by white people, or it originated in Europe among the white people and then it spread to India and was taken over by the brown people. But so either way, half of the Indo-European speech community was white, half of it was brown, and so one half had definitely taken over the language from the others. So at any rate, language did not coincide with race. After 1945, the end of the Second World War, the fall of Nazism, this was universally accepted. You see, the race theory stopped completely. And yet, now the last few years, we have a return of this. You see, in 1900 or so, Aryans were imagined to be a specific physical type. They had a long skull and they had a backhead knob. You see, I didn't know this. A friend of mine who is into this, you know, once said, okay, feel my backhead. And so he had this knob. I don't have it. So I'm not a good Aryan, apparently. But so, you see, it was one of the physical characteristics by which you could discern an Aryan. That's what they thought 100 years ago. Now, that has stopped in 1945, but it has returned in the form of genetics. You know, you have another physical characteristic, namely a gene. And so the gene R1A or RA1A is deemed the Aryan gene. Many Indian papers write about this in all seriousness. You see, among the Harappans, it was very rare, and then it became more common. So this proves that the Aryan gene was brought in. So this is the Aryan invasion, that's what they say. Now, or for instance, of a particular corpse dug up in Harappa, they don't find this gene. And so they conclude in all seriousness, oh, he was Dravidian. Oh, this proves that the Harappa culture was Dravidian speaking. Now, this is total nonsense. And so it's a bit strange that this theory has reappeared. Right, okay. This is Friedrich Max Müller, or Moksha Mula, as he called himself. So in India, people think that he's the originator of the Aryan Invasion Theory. That's not correct. He only took it over. In Germany, it was already very common. He is the one who started the idea, however, that the invasion took place in about 1500 BC. That date is his creation. Now, his own pupil, Moritz Winternitz, also a very capable Indologist, rejected this. He said, you see, the whole literature of the Vedas, the Upanishads, and so on, you cannot cram that together in such a short period. That has to have taken a longer development. So that must have started at least 1,000 years earlier, right? And moreover, Max Müller himself later declared that actually that this was just a wild guess, that he also didn't know the date of the supposed invasion, that it could be 1500 or 3000 or anything, and that he wasn't sure if we would even ever know. And yet, you see, in spite of these denials, this theory has survived. Until today, they believe, oh, it was about 1500 BC. In fact, there is no basis for that at all. What you could say from a Hindu viewpoint against Max Müller is that, of course, he supported India's Christianization. Most of the Orientalist departments in Western universities at that time were part of or very much linked with the theology department. Mostly these professors made a living by teaching Latin and theology and so on to young men becoming priests and specifically becoming missionaries. And so then they had to learn the languages of India and so on that they were going to need. So these Orientalists were teaching for the mission. And that's very much true in the case of Max Müller. However, in spite of that, you see, even people like he were very conscientious Indologists. It is not true that he purposely mistranslated the Vedas. Only he was a child of his time. He went by the paradigms that were alive in those days. And so he was a bit influenced by whatever was available, like the idea that European culture at that point was very much superior and that Indians badly needed to be westernized, to be anglicized, to be Christianized. Okay, that is very much there. Okay, next, Hitler. Yeah. Now, some Aryan invasion defenders try to associate the out of India theory with Hindu nationalism, and that in turn with fascism. Yeah. Now, in fact, you see, this is as untrue as it could ever be, because the Nazi movement was absolutely wedded to the Aryan invasion theory. You see, for British imperialists, it was welcome, but they would have practiced their imperialism anyway, regardless of what the history said. In this case, the Aryan invasion theory was a cornerstone of the Nazi worldview. Look, you see, racists thought that whites were dynamic, and this is proven by the fact that they invaded and conquered the homeland of the brown, indolent Indians. Then these invaders wisely imposed an apartheid system in order to preserve their race. Because if they mixed, then they would degenerate and they would become as inferior as the natives. Excuse me, I'm not saying it, I'm only relating what those racists 100 years ago said. Then you see some race mixing took place anyway, because I mean, all these conquering men, you see, seeing all these beautiful local women, of course, they, were sensitive in spite of the caste apartheid. And so they did some race mixing anyway. And because of this, they became darker skinned, as Indians are, and they became inferior. According to the racist theory, the whiter you are, the most superior you are. If you get darker, generation after generation, you degenerate, you become inferior. And so, and this is now the practical implication, they needed colonization by their cousins who had remained white, because they were superior, they were more capable of giving leadership, of administering this vast country, India. So the Indians were very lucky that the British were kind enough to colonize them. And so the Nazis were great supporters of British colonialism. You see, they ended up having to conduct a war against Britain, but the whole idea of Britain ruling all those Africans and Caribbeans and Indians, that they found excellent. And they had even offered the British German manpower to help administering this empire. Oh, incidentally, in the photograph that you see, of course, Adolf Hitler, and he's shaking hands with someone. Maybe anybody here in the audience knows who he's shaking hands with. So the other man in the picture is Subhas Chandra Bose, who collaborated with the Axis powers. He had a disappointing meeting with Hitler. So the foreign minister of Nazi Germany, von Ribbentrop, he had sort of humored Bose and said that Germany supported the Indian struggle for independence, whereas Hitler gave him a cold shower and said, but what do you need independence for? You are just lucky that the British are willing to be there. So then you see he left Germany, went to Japan to get more support from there. Anyway, what I wanted to say here is that Hitler spoke out very explicitly about the Aryan invasion theory, which incidentally was taught also in the textbooks in German schools. And so he says, we know that the Hindus of India are a people mixed between the lofty Aryan immigrants and the dark black Aboriginal population, and that these Hindus are now bearing the consequences. Namely, they have degenerated, for it is also a slave people of a race that almost seems like a second Jewry, and the Jews were his enemy par excellence. So this is not meant as a compliment. You know, you could say, oh, but the Jews are very intelligent. And so he's saying here that the Indians are also intelligent. No, no, that's not what he means. He means the Jews are dirty and degenerate and so on, and the Hindus likewise. So you see, Hitler was very contemptuous of India and was a great supporter of the Aryan Invasion Theory. In fact, even the denial of the invasion element was also present in Hitler. You see, he says they were Aryan immigrants rather than Aryan invaders. Okay. In India, this racial theory caught on. The first Indian was to voice it was the product of Christian education, namely Jyotirao Phule, who identified the upper castes as Aryan invaders. 150 years later, this idea was still alive when Mallikarjuna Kharge, the Congress Parliamentary Party spokesman, shouted in Parliament, "You Aryans are not Indians, you are from outside India." And when this was reported in a newspaper, the journalist made it even worse. He said, oh, but the only really indigenous people in India are the Adivasis. Now the word Adivasi means aboriginal. And so the implication is that all the non-tribals are not aboriginal, that they're all invaders. But you should know, you see, Indians don't have this classification. And the word Adivasi, being a Sanskrit construct, falsely gives this impression that Indians themselves divided the Indian population in aboriginals and outsiders. That's not the case at all. The word Adivasi was coined by the missionaries in the 1920s. But it's a very successful disinformation campaign. This one word. How many times have I not heard Western India watchers, even learned linguists, say in all naivety, yeah, you know, the Adivasis are the original population. That's what the word means after all. As if the word was not coined specifically to give that impression, right? Anyway, so this system of natives versus invaders, that became the basis of the reservation system by birth, which was pioneered by the Brits in the Government of India Act 1935. And of course, I don't need to tell you that the reservation system has multiplied enormously since then and become a cancer on the Indian polity. Most English-knowing Hindus accepted the Aryan invasion theory because of the prestige. You know, they didn't want to go against modern science, and they thought, oh, science has proven the Aryan invasion theory. It had not, but that's what they thought. The first immigrants in America even used this theory in their favor, because in America, color at that time was very important. And so they could claim status as whites because of the Aryan invasion theory. You see, they said, oh, but we are the whites who invaded India long ago, but we're white. You know, classify us as white. Some judges agreed, some didn't, but they certainly tried. In India, many interiorized it, like Balagangadhara Tilak taught up his own version, where the Aryans came from the Arctic. And the funny thing is that many Westerners now quote Tilak with the implication that, oh, even the Indians themselves say that they come from elsewhere. Whereas you see, Tilak did not base himself on anything natively Indian. He just borrowed the Aryan invasion theory. And then he applied it to Indian traditions, totally misinterpreting them. Now, the question of where this homeland was is not so important. You see, in the whole world, many peoples, many nations come from elsewhere than where they are living now. America is the best example, but many other countries are like that. Like the Romanians, for example, you know, they live in the Balkans in Eastern Europe, but they know very well that they are the remains of a colony founded by the Romans. The Roman Emperor Trajanus conquered this area. And so he's the father of the fatherland. All squares in Romania are named after him. He has big statues and so on. And so they know very well, we are the children of a conquest, of an invasion, and they don't mind. And so this counts for very, very, very many countries. And so if India was made up of foreigners, that would, strictly speaking, not have much consequence. However, it is the Aryan invasion supporters in India, the Ambedkarites, the Dravidianists, the Christian missionaries, who make much of it and who still say, like Mallikarjuna Kharge did, oh, Aryans, you know, people descended from Aryans 4,000 years ago, they don't belong in India. Now, I mean, how can you say that in seriousness? People whose ancestors 4,000 years ago were this or that, and therefore today they don't belong in India. I mean, it's incredible that this thing can be said in all seriousness. But so that's why you're up against, and therefore it comes in very handy that this Aryan invasion theory is not true. So Hindu nationalists are very happy when they hear that a few scholars are now pioneering the out of India theory again and are deconstructing and breaking apart the Aryan invasion theory. Strangely, in the West, many scholars don't want to engage with the out of India theory because they associate it with Hindu nationalism, which is also wrong in itself. But at any rate, which is totally beside the point. Whatever people's political or other motives, they can still say the truth. And so that in the mind of a scholar, that should not be important. You see, is it true or not? That's important. Not do they have an ulterior motive? And anyway, it is precisely the Aryan invasion theory itself that is politicized since far longer than the out of India theory, in many more ways, in many more countries, espoused not by a few scholars in some dusty library, no, espoused by the rulers, by the British Empire, the largest empire in world history, by Nazi Germany. And so it's a far more seriously politicized theory. So if you dislike politics, if you don't want to soil your hands on a political theory, then you should absolutely shun the Aryan invasion theory. That's the most politicized theory in history that was ever thought of. And yet, I say for myself, the fact that it was so heavily politicized does not imply that it is wrong. I think it is wrong, but for different reasons. That it is politicized, that's not important. You see, many people in India say, oh, the Aryan theory was concocted by the British imperialists. Now, I wonder, you see, if anyone has thought of, what this means. So you see, one afternoon, some British, Governor General of the East India Company sits thinking, sipping his tea. Oh, what shall I do to fool these damned Indians? And then suddenly he fires up, Eureka! Oh, I have it. I'm going to invent a linguistic theory. Yeah. And you see, that's not how things happen in the world of scholarship. There were no politicians involved. Once the Aryan Invasion Theory was accepted by enough scholars, then the politicians thought, oh my God, you see, this could have its uses. And then they started promoting the theory, but by that time the theory had already come about. Around the year 2000, Edwin Bryant, whom you see in the photograph, he brought together scholars from the two sides, and for a few years, there was something of a debate, including by your great friend, Michael Witzel, as well as by Hans-Heinrich Hock. And so even if they defended the Aryan invasion theory, they took the out of India theory seriously enough to argue against it. And on the Hindu side too, a few people got out of their echo chamber, where unfortunately since then they have retreated, and tried to defend the out of India theory in the face of the enemy. Unfortunately, most Hindus, even those who give lectures about this, you see, don't know the other side, don't know the arguments of the Aryan invasion people. And so they pretend that there is really no debate, that their own theory has won, and that nobody believes in the Aryan invasion theory anymore. Now that's not true. You see, like here you have the picture on the left of Dr. Rajaram, Navaratna Rajaram. So he was a great physicist working for the American Space Organization, but he was an amateur historian, and you know, he made some mistakes that amateurs make. And so he's typical for a whole class of Indian history rewriters who just don't take the historical method seriously, and so who, well, have not attracted the respect of their adversaries. So this came to a head with the California textbook affair, 2005, 2006, when there were a number of biased remarks about Hinduism in the textbooks that Hindus wanted to correct. Now they would have succeeded had they not, after a lead given by Rajaram, claimed that the Aryan invasion theory is out, is obsolete, that nobody believes in it anymore. You see, that was just wrong. And when they said this, then Michael Witzel and Stanley Wolpert intervened, supported by most Indologists, and just blocked most of the edits that the Hindus had proposed, not just about the Aryan invasion theory, but many others that were perfectly reasonable and that would have been accepted if the Hindus themselves had not brought in the Aryan invasion question. Then they tried to, so they lost. The Board of Education decided against their proposals. Then they tried to have their way anyway by going to court. They lost. They went on appeals trial. They lost again. But this was really the absolute depth of Hindu self-defense against their many adversaries. Since then, fortunately, you see, they have corrected their ways. 10 years later, there was another round of reform of the textbooks, and then they did succeed to a moderate extent. But so they are on a curve upwards, and I'm confident that in 2025, they will really have their way. Since then, since about 2005, however, the Aryan invasion side has resorted to complete stonewalling. They just don't want to talk to us or with us. There was a famous Indologist, Stephanie Jamieson, who wrote, in fact, the recent most translation of the Rig Veda. And so she said, and I quote, the parallels between the intelligent design issue, that is creationism, the idea that the world was created in 6 days, like it is said in the Bible, And the Indo-Aryan controversy are distressingly close. You see, it's a manufactured one with a non-scholarly agenda, that is to say the out of India theory. And the tactics of its manufacturers, look, we have tactics. We have manufactured this theory, are very close to, creationism. And so the two editors, namely Bryant and Patton, who had published this book with a debate with actually, the two viewpoints side by side, they only give credibility to this ridiculous superstitious theory of the, out of India. And so she said that, it is better not to talk to these ridiculous religio-nationalistic attackers of the scholarly consensus. And ever since, you see, that's what's happened. Most people have refused to talk to us. Now, in fact, you see, this is flatly untrue. The out of India theory never posited something supernatural. You see, one homeland is as good as another. For instance, in the 1990s, briefly, there was a theory that the homeland was in Anatolia, not on the steppes, but in Anatolia. Now, that was found to be wrong, but nevertheless, that was taken seriously. That was debated. You see, people said, okay, they were wrong, but nobody said they are ridiculous. They are superstitious. They are not worthy of talking to. Yeah, well, anyway, so contemptuous stonewalling at the moment is the state of the debate. Joanna Nichols is another Indologist, or linguist. In 1997, she produced a paper showing that the pattern of exchange of loan words with the languages of Mesopotamia, which have borrowed many Indo-European words and also given their own words to Indo-European, that shows that the Indo-Europeans came from the East. Now, I will spare you the explanation of, linguistically why this should be so, but an implication of this, which Shrikant Talageri, of course, deduced, is that, well, they came from the East. So they came from India or near India. I mean, first they have to go out from India to Afghanistan, and then from there, they have an open space going to the West. Now, here she says, in a recent version of her paper published on academia.edu, which is the platform that most scholars use, she adds that, you see, this theory still stands, but the implication that the homeland was in the East, that is no longer true. It cannot be used for that. So it's a very silly or funny situation that she still stands by her own theory, but not with the implications of that theory, namely out of India. And so Shrikant Talageri makes fun of the radical damage control measures and the weird about turns by people like her, such as the Stalin era-like retraction by Joanna Nichols of her plea for an Eastern origin of linguistic features in West Asian languages. And he attributes this to peer pressure. Similarly, Klaus-Peter Zoller stands by his discovery of Proto-Bangani, of a number of Western words found in India, in Uttarakhand, proving that these Western member languages came from India. And so he stands by his discovery, and yet he protests against its use in the service of the out of India theory, when obviously it implies the out of India theory. And so you can see that the pressure on scholars to conform to the Aryan Invasion Theory is enormous. Either because, you see, it's an established theory and people cling to what is familiar, or secondly, because they don't look at the facts and are just frightened by the association of the out of India theory with Hindu nationalism. Of course, it's hardly any use of explaining to them that the Hindu nationalist movement is not so bad, because by now in the West, there is this enormous hatred against it. Like, you know, almost as we speak, you know, next week, there's going to be this conference in America of dismantling Hindutva, right? So it's quite unthinkable that this would be said about other religions. There's a, you know, a hatred with good conscience against Hindus. And so that conditions also the attitude to the out of India theory. So to sum up, you see, to end, as a parting shot, I'm going to give some advice to all of you. I mean, strictly speaking, it is advice to the Western Indo-Europeanists, but it really also counts for Indians. Namely that, you know, you should not have opinions being for the out of India theory and against the Aryan invasion. No, you should first of all have knowledge. You see, most people who say they are against the Aryan invasion theory don't know properly what the Aryan invasion theory says. Much less do they know what the out of India theory says. So the first thing to do is to familiarize yourself with what is the out of India theory. Now, the man who has explained all this is not a Westerner. You see, on the whole, I think Indians have not performed very well in this debate. You know, they've not taken the trouble of really studying what are the arguments. Why should this be true and not this? Most Indians. And so a few good arguments for the out of India theory have been developed by Westerners, by Western archaeologists, by the Sanskritist Nikolaos Kazanas from Greece. I myself have also contributed. You know, it's well, striking that the few names who have really contributed to this are Western names. Now, I have to correct this. In the field of archaeology, by contrast, most archaeologists in India have already discovered in whichever Harappan site that they are excavating, that there is no sign at all of such an invasion. And so I've been to archaeological conferences in Delhi where one archaeologist after another came to say, we don't find any discontinuity. This is all local development, there were no invaders. But they don't participate in the debate so much. You don't hear much from them. By contrast, Shrikant Talageri is very explicit. And moreover, he has far stronger evidence. You see, what we have developed is some of the linguistic pointers to the out of India scenario. What the archaeologists have offered is archaeological pointers, but that's all very indirect evidence. By contrast, Talageri has, to everybody's surprise, to my own surprise too, found that actually there is a human testimony, a human description of the disintegration of Proto-Indo-European, which started according to Indian tradition with Manu who settled in Ayodhya. And so from there, from Ayodhya, the lunar dynasty went west to the Saraswati basin, then created the 5 tribes and so on. That was Northwest India. And so from there, some of them have gone west. And in the Rig Veda, you find a memory of the first part of this emigration, those people who went to Europe, the Slavs, the Celts, the Germans, and so on, me. They descend from the Druhyu tribe. Then later in the Veda itself, you see witness of the emigration of the Anu tribe. Those are the Iranians, the Greeks, the Armenians. And that happens within the Vedic period itself. So everybody thought, okay, the dispersion of the Indo-Europeans from the homeland. That was in about 3700 BC, whereas the first writing in Indo-European languages was in about 1500 BC, more than 2000 years later, right? So against that, Talageri says, no, 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 no. The dispersion of Indo-European was still going on when the Vedas were being composed. And so we have actual testimony. So that's quite spectacular. And so once this whole debate is over, the name that will be remembered is that of Srikant Talageri. So he greatly saved the honor of Indians who, were not prepared for this debate. But, he, without much preparation, just stumbled upon it, and then pure logic, led him to what is probably the correct answer. And so, so the Out of India theory, describes how all of us originated in Northwest India, or at least our linguistic ancestors, you see, who in my case, of course, intermarried with locals in Central Asia, then in Europe. But so their language, the transmission of language ultimately goes back to North India. Right, I've taken enough of your time. So my lecture ends here, but I am entirely available for questions. And expands, in order to populate and expands from Bengal to Ireland, you have at any rate to have a migration. People migrated. They did not originate in Bengal and in Ireland and then speak the same language. How could they? There was no radio, there was no internet at that time. So no, they originated in one place where they lived together so that they developed the same language. And then by separating geographically, they gradually separated linguistically. And so when their children, their grandchildren met somehow, covering this long distance, they could still understand each other. But after a few generations, the languages differentiated, became very different, became ununderstandable. But so they at any rate migrated. So to say Aryan migration theory, that doesn't mean anything. If you say Aryan immigration theory, that of course is meaningful. And so that's what people prefer. That's what its own advocates prefer. They don't like to taint it with the memory of wars and conquests and so on, though that's what in fact they imply. But they don't want to say that. So they prefer the term immigration theory. But you see, if you think that immigration theory or invasion theory makes a difference, I'm afraid that the implication is that you just don't understand what the debate is about. The debate is about where was the homeland. Now, whether the people came from the homeland as peaceful immigrants, yet imposing the language and religion, which is a very strange scenario, or if they came by conquest and then imposed their language and religion, that's more logical. But whether they did the one or the other, at any rate, they came from outside. Now, that's the whole question. You see, did Sanskrit come from outside India? Is Mallikarjuna Kharge right when he says, oh, you people don't belong to India? You come from outside, whether by violence or peacefully. But at any rate, the criterion is, do you come from outside? And so I say, no, they don't come from outside. Not that it would be a problem if you come from outside. Like, for instance, there are several groups in India that have come from the outside. First of all, there was a peaceful immigration. The Syrian Christians came in the 4th century as refugees. They were given asylum in Kerala and they integrated. And the Parsis came from Iran in the 9th century to Gujarat. And again, you see they assimilated or they integrated. Then you have the not so peaceful scenario of the invasion of the Turks or the Arabs, even of Ethiopian slave soldiers that they brought along. You know, that they became the Siddhis, a community in Gujarat, Maharashtra. And so you see, they are in India since about 1,000 years or 500 years or so. Moreover, they mixed completely with native Indians because they were all soldiers, they were men. So they married or they fathered children upon Indian women, often by rape or by sex slavery, or, you know, it's always not so nice. But at any rate, the second generation was 50% Indian already. And then it continued diluting the foreign element, okay? But so the origin, you know, like most Muslim families, in purely paternal line, descend from some Arab or Turkish invader. And also some Hindu communities, like the Jats and the Rajputs, are reputed, I haven't closely studied it, but that's what the history books say, come from the Scythian and the Hun invasions, right? Like the Jats, the word Jat is the same word as in Iranian get, no, not in Iranian Greek, get like the Massa Getai. There are some tribe in the time of Alexander the Great or so. And so some of them ended up in India and they became the Jat caste. Similarly, the Rajput castes are supposed to be Scythians, Iranians originally. Then some Brahmins, Maga Brahmins, came from Iran. When Iran was Islamized, it became very unpleasant for them, so they fled to India. And so on, like the Nagas. You see, the Nagas are a tribe in the far northeast of India, in Nagaland. And they, you know, are called Adivasis, Aboriginals, because the tribals are called Adivasis in many official documents in India. Yet they only entered India about 1,000 years ago from the east, from Thailand or so they came. And so they're immigrants. But you see, who is going to say, oh, they are here for only 1,000 years, so we are going to deny them the right to stay in India? I mean, come on. So you see, this whole issue of where did they come from is really is just a silly issue. It has become important because of its politicization by the Aryan Invasion Party. And so the out of India theory, well, it's either true or not, but its political value, you know, is perfectly innocent. It's trying to ward off this threat of the Aryan Invasion theory, which is used by all your enemies.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
You see, of course, I agree that all India's social problems, including caste, have become far more acute, far more serious by the socialist policies of Nehru and Indira.
That's correct.
Now, first, you see, the sultans in the Delhi Sultanate already exploited the Indians enormously. Because there was not only the jizya, the toleration tax that all Hindus had to pay, they also imposed a very heavy land tax, right, which caused the disruption of agriculture and great famines. Then under the Mughals, it was a bit better economically, because there was some kind of compromise between the Muslims and the Hindus, thanks to Akbar in his later life. Then you had the British. They didn't kill much. They didn't destroy temples or anything, on the contrary. But they came to exploit. They came to make it to India to make money. That was really the reason why they were in India. So they crippled the Indian economy enormously. Now, fortunately, the end of the British period was a time of great growth, thanks to the Second World War. because India was the production center of the British Empire. It was the base that they had for production of military material and so on for the war effort. And so the Indian economy grew enormously. And in spite of Mahatma Gandhi, who wanted a boycott of the war effort, you see all the loans of the government were completely subscribed to. You see, all the people, did business with the government in order to make their own business grow. And so, you see, without meaning to do so, in fact, the British greatly helped the Indian economy. And so, if Indians at the time of independence had taken up that animus and continued it, you see, India was very well on its way to recover. I mean, if you compare that, for instance, to Germany and Japan were completely destroyed in 1945. Korea in 1953 was completely rubbled, and they had to start from zero, and yet look what a success they became. So India was off to that kind of success. Unfortunately, you had Nehru and Indira who spoiled it all. And they said Garibi Hatao, but they caused poverty like never before. And so that exacerbated the caste oppositions and so on enormously. So in terms of getting the economy well on track, I'd say the BJP under Vajpayee and under Modi has done quite well. It has also lessened corruption and so on. So in terms of quality of life, that's good. I'm very critical of the role in supporting Hindu culture, but that's a different matter. But you see, at any rate, the economy, that's very good. Unfortunately, in, I think, 2016, they have also supported and aggravated this scheduled caste, scheduled tribe law, which creates a great inequality where lower castes are favored by the courts and so on in case of disputes. And so that's a very negative effect. But anyway, these are just small short-term things, because people want to do something about what they perceive as the problem that the caste system poses. What I have to say here, I'm not going to advise you on modern politics and what to do, but about history, there I dare say something. You see, caste has nothing to do with the question that we've been discussing today. It's only the Aryan invasion people who say that. It's they who say, oh, the Aryans came in and they imposed the caste system. That's not true at all. You see, the caste system doesn't even go back that far. In the Vedas, you have no caste system. And no question of caste system. There is even a verse, you see, often quoted by the Arya Samaj, who were for the Vedas, but against the caste system, where some rishi says, oh, my father was a craftsman. And so it was perfectly normal for your father to be this and you to be something else. That was, the done thing. Then you in the Ramayana have Rama fraternizing with these forest people and so on, and no question of caste discrimination. Only in a later part that was added afterwards, the Uttarakhand, there you get the Shambhuk episode, which is militantly casteist. But you see, that's from much later. And so you get caste under what's his name, Veda Vyasa. You see, he's a good proof of how there was no caste system. His parents are not of the same caste. His father is the sage Parashara, descendant of Vasishtha, and his mother is some fisherwoman. In fact, it transpires that she's not really a fisherwoman, she's also a princess. But even a princess, a Kshatriya, is not the same as a Brahmin. So that's still Varna Sankara, that's still mixture of caste. Well, that was perfectly normal. There was no question of it. And nobody said to Vyasa, oh, you are not a real Brahmin because your mother wasn't. It's just not. Then you see later, in the time of the Buddha, that's 1,000 years later, you still see that this paternal, paternal caste system, that you have the same vocation as your father, but not of your mother, and your father and your mother can be any caste they want. That's still alive at the time of the Buddha. His friend Prasenajit, the king of Kosala, discovers at some point that his wife, whom he married thinking she's a Kshatriya, is not a real Kshatriya, or that at least her father was a Kshatriya, but her mother was not. And so he repudiates her, and the Buddha says, come on, you shouldn't do this. And indeed, you see, the Buddha is convincing because he takes her back. But still, you see, he says, well, you see, the caste of the mother doesn't matter. It's only that of the father that counts. You see, so her father is a Kshatriya. You are a Kshatriya, so your son is definitely a Kshatriya, whatever your wife is. And so Prasenajit and his son remonstrate. They say, no. The new system is that the caste of both parents matters. So you see that the Buddha is defending the old system where caste already exists, but it's purely in the paternal line. And then the new system is endogamy, where the parents have to belong to the same caste. That's the new system, and that only among the aristocracy at the time. So we're talking 500 before Christ, 2,500 years ago. We still don't have the full caste system. It is in an embryonic stage in the aristocracy. And then you see, once the aristocracy adopts this endogamy, then gradually the lower classes start behaving the same way. And here comes modern science. Geneticists have established that the Indian population was mixed through and through like that of every other country until about 1800 years ago. And then you get a division of the Indian population into box-type groups, the jatis. And then endogamy enters, and everybody starts marrying within their own caste group. So caste is not even 2,000 years old, right? And so there is nothing intrinsically casteist about Hinduism. You see, the Christian missionaries go around saying, yeah, but you see, caste is intrinsic to Hinduism. You can't get away from caste without abolishing Hinduism. And so that's just historically incorrect. Hinduism existed for thousands of years before caste came. Even the Purusha Sukta, which is always used as how you see Vedic support for casteism, doesn't have anything of caste. It only says there are 4 different functions in society. And then it doesn't say how these are recruited. It doesn't say you have to do whatever your father did. And it certainly doesn't say you have to marry someone from the same group. So, and those are the 2 defining elements of caste, hereditary profession and endogamy. And so they are not there in the Purusha Sutta at all. So you see, caste originally didn't exist. Then gradually it came into existence, then it became very firm, very severe. Then it started disintegrating again. I know in Holland, which is just near here, there is a big Hindu community coming from Suriname. And so in the 150 years or so that they've lived there outside India, they've completely lost caste. And they're Hindus, they're very firm Hindus. You see, they are like centered around the Ramcharitmanas. You know, they're Rama worshippers from Bhojpur, you know, Eastern UP, Western Bihar. And I mean, they're Hindus and they're still Hindi speaking after all these generations. And, you know, their Hindu temples and so on are exactly Hindu temples. So they are Hindus and without caste. So, you know, if you think caste is a problem, then I have good news for you.
Thank you. Yeah, the colonial, I know that
I
never
have a question.
existed.
One
in
question, can I ask?
Oh,
You came. So any comments on that? You thought about
Yeah,
that?
well, you see, with genetics, you can show all kinds of people's movements. And what David Reich has published a few years ago is, of course, an attempt in that direction. It's very incomplete. It doesn't account for all the population movements that have taken place. Like one of the other authors, you know, in genetics, of course, Indians have contributed a lot. And you see in linguistics, they're nowhere. There is no serious linguistic study in India going on. I mean, where would the specialists come from? But you see in engineering and so on, Indians are very good. And so as soon as genetics came into play, then you see some Indians have contributed mightily. Only, well, anyway, let's go into what they have contributed. You see, David Reich and so on have said the Aryan invaders are characterized by this gene R1A1. And so that came into India around 1500 BC. Now, I've already shown that the Vedas are definitely from earlier than 1500 BC. But anyway, you see, population movements don't say anything about language. And Indian history proves it 100%. You see, there have been many invasions in India of people who left their genes, and the Indian population today has plenty of genes brought in by the Scythians, by the Greeks, by the Huns, by the Kushanas, by the Syrian Christians, by the Parsis, by the Turks, by the Arabs, by the Afghans, by the Ethiopian slave soldiers. You see, all those genes are in India, and yet not one of those groups has preserved its own language. There is no Turkish lobby in India. There is no Ethiopian lobby in India. You see, in religion, yes, they managed to remain Muslims. There is a Muslim lobby in India, as I don't need to tell you. But in terms of language, all of them, even in spite of the strongly separatist ideology of Islam, you see, that played a role in maintaining their religion, but it was not strong enough to help them maintain their language. They have all given up their language. And so the Aryan Invasion Theory is really saying, okay, all these groups gave up their language, but the Aryans were different. Now here you have a lot of explaining to do. You see, why were the Aryans different? How could such a small group of barbarians from the steppes impose their language, their culture on a vastly larger and more evolved population? That goes against anything that we know in history.
Thank you.
Question.
Yeah.
So to continue that caste system, even Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, Chatur Varna Maya Srishtam Gun Karma Vibhaga Sa. And in 18th chapter, he describes the qualities of Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Sudra. And never he said it is by Janma.
Yeah, well, that is a debatable point because we don't know when the Gita was written. I've already mentioned in the Uttarakhand, in the Ramayana, you have a clear projection of a much later text that was put into an old text in order to give it more authority. And so by that time, the caste system was in existence and they wanted to give scriptural sanction to the caste system. So they put in a chapter in this ancient and very venerated Ramayana. So the Gita might be a similar thing. That's what some Western scholars say. Now here, I don't know. I know that the Gita is definitely in the form of the oldest part of the Mahabharata, where it is Sanjay who reports to King Dhritarashtra what he sees with his mind's eye of what is happening on the battlefield. And so it is in the oldest part, Jaya, the central part of the Mahabharata, that you have this, this setting of Sanjay telling the story to Dhritarashtra. Now, in the Gita, you have that. This is Sanjay Uvacha. And so formally, at least, it seems to be an old part of the Mahabharata. Then again, the editors, of course, may have engineered it in such a way that it looks old. And so I don't know about the part about caste. I mean, I've studied it, but you know, I have no definitive opinion about that. So that may be a later interpolation supporting caste. At any rate, that's how Hindus in the Middle Ages interpreted it. They used the Gita as support for the caste system. But then you see that may be an interpretation from the days when caste was everywhere. And that's not necessarily correct. And so the modern interpretation that this is about karma and guna and not about janma, that may be true. But so that I have no definitive opinion on. So I know this argument, it's important, but I'm not very sure if the one or the other is correct.
Thank you.
Yeah, in my opinion, it's just a creative theory, like I said before, to just divide and rule. That's all it is. It is not sanctioned in any scripture. It is not sanctioned in any literature or any Ramayana or Mahabharata. We do not see a trace of the caste system. So it is just a creative thing to rule, because they had, you know, that's what their strategy was.
Yeah.
To divide and rule. So Puru Sukta, like you said, it is nothing to do with this thing, you know. So it is a very, very serious thing. And it is not a question about it. I have a request to you, if you can later, maybe sometimes whenever you have time, to go on this, the Gautam Buddha was every inch Hindu.
Yeah, of course.
It was,
That's a different discussion, but yes, of course.
yeah, I know. Okay, we have some other questions.
I
Please.
was actually Memorial Fund,
Yeah.
and I think Sitaram Goel, I never met him, but I think I knew him since my last birth, and I could not see him.
Yeah, that's possible.
And in Srikant Talgeri's first book in 1994, he wrote a preface,
yeah,
quoting Nehru's sentence, which I read that when I was 8 years old. Can you not see them, Aryans trekking beyond the Himalaya pass? And reading that, I actually went in my memory 3,500 years back to verify Aryan Invasion of India. And there, what I read, I will read in the middle of the Shukla Yajurveda Bhashya. So what I'm saying here, please tell us something about Sitaram Goel, Ram's book, and which book we should all read. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it is right now Sitaram Goel's centenary year. So he was born 100 years ago on 16th of October. So on that day, we will have a teleconference about Sitaram Goel, to which you are all invited, and you get the invitations. So that's, you know, my practical answer. Okay. About their involvement with the Aryan invasion debate. Well, Goel as a publisher, of course, has given all chance to Talageri and to myself and to Nicolas Casanas to publish about it. And so, yes, and in fact, the book that set the ball rolling again, that relaunched the Out of India theory, namely Setana's book Karpasa, Cotton in Ancient India, that was also published by Sitaram Goel. And so, you see, apart from his very important contribution to understanding Islam and Christianity and communism, you see, even in the Aryan invasion debate, he has played a certain role as a publisher. You see, so he made this whole debate possible. That's also a historic contribution.
Yeah, please let us know when there is a conference so we can attend it. Thank you.
Yes, okay. Mhm. Okay.
Okay, do we have any other questions?
Is there any, Koenraadji, one request, not question. Is there any information the viewer can know that how to help your research work or the Sitaram Goel's foundation, the help? So, an information to the viewers on how people can help.
Well, financially, of course, I have a Payoneer account, or what's it called? Something with Payoneer, yeah. But I mean, you just Google my name and you see. But in terms of what interests me more, namely the contents-wise progress of the Out of India theory, well, not everybody is gifted in that sense, but those who are, of course, there is still a lot of work to be done. Like, for instance, to show how the internal relations between the different Prakrit dialects, Bhojpuri and Awadhi and Marwari and so on, what they show about the origin of the Indo-Aryan languages. Like, for example, you can see, if you reconstruct the history of those languages, that they do not descend from Sanskrit. You see, in the Aryan Invasion Theory, all Indian languages descend from Sanskrit, because you have the scenario that the Aryans came into India in Punjab, and there they wrote the Vedas, and then from there they spread all over India, right? And so all the languages spoken there, Bengali and Gujarati and so on, are descendants from Sanskrit. Now that's not correct. You see, as per the Vedic and Puranic evidence, Vedic Sanskrit was a dialect of one particular tribe, the Puru tribe, which was related to the dialect of the Anu tribe, from which Iranian and Greek and so on descend, which was related also to the dialect of the Druhiu tribe, from whom Slavic and Germanic and Celtic came forth. But you see, it's not true that all Indian languages descend from this Puru dialect. You also, for instance, had an Ikshwaku dialect of the Solar dynasty in Ayodhya. And farther east, you had Magadhi or Ardha Magadhi and so on. You had all these different dialects, which are the mothers of each of the modern Indian languages. And often they have characteristics that are not traceable to Vedic Sanskrit. And so, you see, this helps to better understand that at the time of the Vedas, there were many other Indian ethnic groups also. There were other tribes more to the east. And so that's incompatible with the scenario where the Vedic people are just entering India, fighting their way against the Black Aboriginals and so on. So you see, that's something only Indians can do. I mean, I have some textbook knowledge of Hindi, but that's absolutely not the same as, I hear some indigenous linguists, talk about all these dialectal difference, Braj Bhasha and Punjabi and so on. So only a native can do that. So that's, for instance, something that can be contributed. Then among archaeologists, you see, they have very capably shown how the Indian sites, the Harappan sites, do not show any evidence of a disruption, of an invasion. The next thing they should do is to go outside India and see how you find a trail of tribes emigrating from India. For instance, there is recently more evidence about archaeological sites in Oman, in Arabia, a part of the world people don't think of, where nothing happens. But so that was an important colony of Harappa. And so you find a lot of influence there. Now, the same thing you have in Afghanistan, in Uzbekistan, and so on. And so that really deserves to be explored further. You see, now you have only fragments, and they are always interpreted in terms of the Aryan Invasion Theory, because that's the only paradigm that Western scholars know. But so if you really research this stuff again and find also more material, because there's a lot to be excavated yet, you know, you can reconstruct the migration of Indians to the Northwest. So that's the next thing that has to be done. So those are things that Indians can contribute. Because I mean, I think we are not far from actually proving that the Vedas testify to an emigration from India. But then there's a lot more, you know, to the emigration scenario that needs to be reconstructed. There we will have to, you know, use the services of archaeologists, for instance. So there's a lot to be done. And so, but fortunately there are many of you. So I'm confident that this will also be done.
I think we have taken a lot of time of Dr. Koenraad,
Yeah.
so we can